According to a new report from the War Zone, the U.S. Navy has expended nearly 400 individual munitions and interceptors, taking down Houthi drones and missiles over the Red Sea, spanning the past 15 months or so. And by my math, that means Uncle Sam has burned through something in the neighborhood of around $780 million worth of munitions in this effort. Now that is a whole lot of money, and there's really no other way to look at it. But invariably, whenever we talk about these sorts of efforts, we always end up falling into the same trap of the cost exchange ratio. Now, the cost exchange ratio, for those who aren't familiar with it, is the cost of the interceptor that you might use to bring down an airborne threat versus the cost of that airborne threat to your adversary. And whenever you spend more on the interceptor than your adversary spends on the weapon you're bringing down, you have a negative cost exchange ratio. And as far as internet analysts all around the world would have you believe, the United States may be taking down these threats, but they're still on the losing end of these exchanges because of that cost exchange ratio. But I'm here to tell you that that just isn't true. And in reality, air defense always costs more than the attacks. That's the nature of warfare. So let's talk about how the US Navy is burning through all this cash, and most importantly, why we need to get past this simplistic cost exchange ratio discussion and acknowledge the complexity of warfare. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. A new artificial intelligence chatbot created by the Chinese company DeepSeek recently hit the market, and users and now several news outlets are beginning to notice how heavily censored or curated the AI responses are to topics deemed sensitive or inappropriate by the Chinese government. This AI model and its ties to the Chinese government could have significant technological, economic, and foreign policy implications as time presses on, and you better believe I'm staying on top of it, thanks to Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by news outlets all around the world and places them all into a single easy-to-read feed, making it simpler than ever to not just stay on top of what's going on in the world, but also to peer through the veil of bias that's so common in today's news media. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 155 news outlets have already covered this story, with left-leaning outlets emphasizing the censorship itself, with headlines like DeepSeek and ChatGPT answer sensitive questions about China differently, whereas some right-leaning outlets are being a bit more cheeky, poking fun at China's Xi Jinping and the nation's censorship laws with headlines like, "Who is Winnie the Pooh?" ChatGPT and DeepSeek's new AI chatbot beg to differ. Now, references to Winnie the Pooh, it's worth noting, have been legally banned from the Chinese internet since 2017, ever since memes depicting Z as the honey-loving bear began to surface. Ground News also shows you vital information about each outlet, like their political bias, factuality rating, corporate ownership, or government affiliations. And I love the Ground News For You tab that compiles stories that are sure to interest me based on the topics I've chosen to stay on top of. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. In fact, I can get you a great deal. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's or follow the link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. The first thing you need to know is that the US Navy mounts its air defense efforts using the Aegis combat system in a variety of interceptors launched from their Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Ticonderoga-class cruisers. Now, these interceptors come in a variety of forms and range in price pretty dramatically, and according to the War Zone sources, the Navy has expended some 120 SM-2 interceptors over the Red Sea in the past 15 months. Now, the SM-2 is maybe the Navy's most heavily relied upon interceptor. It is a broadly capable weapon that can bring down targets out to north of 100 miles at altitudes up to 65,000 feet. And these weapons ring in at an average price of around $2.5 million apiece, meaning in just SM-2s, the Navy has burned through roughly $300 million worth of ordnance. From there, we go to the SM-6, which is perhaps the most maneuverable and capable interceptor in the American air defense apparatus. This is the only interceptor that's rated to bring down hypersonic missiles, and more conventionally, to bring down ballistic missiles during the terminal stages of their flight path. Now, these weapons ring in at around $4.3 million apiece, so launching 80 of these costs around $344 million to replace. From there, we go to the comparatively inexpensive Evolved Sea Sparrow missile, which is a short to medium range self-defense interceptor that rings in at only around $1.5 million apiece. Now, the Navy didn't say exactly how many of these weapons they launched. They said they launched 20 of these and SM-3s combined, which are the most expensive interceptors. So we'll play it safe and say 10 of those were Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles at a total cost of roughly $15 million. But then we come to the priciest of the bunch, the SM-3 interceptor, which is a weapon capable of intercepting ballistic missiles at the midpoint in their flight path in low Earth orbit. Now, these interceptors can range in price from as low as $12 million to as much as $28 million for the most advanced iterations. But these likely weren't those, so we'll call it $12 million, and the 10 of them expended over the past 15 months alone rings in at around $120 million. And then, from most expensive to least, the Navy has also expended roughly 160 5-inch shells for their deck guns, each of which ring in at around $2,000, making for a total in $320,000 worth of 5-inch shells, for a total of roughly $780 million. So that's the American cost. Let's figure out the rest of this exchange ratio, and to do that, we'll need to make some guesstimates, because we don't know exactly which types of weapons they launched or how many of each type they launched. But we know the Navy claims they launched something in the neighborhood of 400 weapons, and we know the standard types of weapons they employ and the costs of them, which could range from as low as maybe $20,000 to as high as multiple millions of dollars each. Now, the weapon you'll see referenced in the most headlines and social media discourse is, of course, the Shahed 136 kamikaze drone, which, according to some media outlets, may ring in at as low as $20,000 a pop. But according to a hacker group called the Prana Network, who gained access to an Iranian shell corporation actually selling these drones to Russia, the actual price for a Shahed 136 is more like $375,000 apiece. So using 400 weapons as our baseline figure and acknowledging that the Houthis do use weapons that may be as cheap as just $20,000 to $50,000 apiece at times, though they likely do cost more, as well as acknowledging that they also launched weapons that cost $1 to $2 million apiece, we can come up with an estimated range, saying 400 weapons at an average cost per weapon of $50,000 would give us a low-end estimate of around $20 million worth of ordnance. Conversely, if the average weapon cost was roughly $500,000, acknowledging that those Shahed 136s probably ring in the 300 to 400K range, and they likely didn't use all that many multi-million-dollar weapons, well, then we're looking at a pretty reasonable estimate for the Houthi expenditure at around $200 million. But that still does create a pretty stark cost exchange ratio, with the United States spending at minimum 3.9 times as much as the Houthis and their Iranian backers, and maybe as much as 39 times more than the Houthis and Iran. But it's also really important to look for context. Now, I can't find reliable figures for the Houthis' annual defense expenditures, but they receive a great deal of support from their deeper-pocketed friends in Iran. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that the Houthis have access to Iran's entire defense budget, which this year saw a big boost up to around $25.3 billion, versus America's 2024 defense budget of around $824.3 billion, meaning America's annual defense expenditure alone is 32.5 times bigger than all of Iran's, let alone the Houthis alone. And if you want to zoom out even further, in 2024, Iran's GDP was estimated at $410.5 billion, versus America's GDP at $27.36 trillion, or roughly 66.5 times bigger than Iran's entire economy. So yeah, the US is indeed spending more, but out of much bigger pools of money. And while that cost exchange ratio is a great way to drive clicks and headlines and to get people talking in the comments section, it completely ignores other very important variables to consider, like the value or cost of replacing the assets that you were protecting. It also ignores the precedent that would be set by allowing the Houthis to just take control of the Red Sea because they got themselves some anti-ship missiles. And maybe most importantly, it ignores the incredible value the United States and its partner nations are getting in real-world data and training as they engage these airborne threats. In fact, according to the War Zone's reporting, after each of these engagements, terabytes of data are pulled from these vessels and then analyzed and scrutinized to identify issues or problems or just find places for improvement. And this has manifested an actual positive change already, with some software issues being identified early in this endeavor, and then specialists being flown out to the Red Sea to make changes to these systems while they're deployed to improve their responsiveness. And the US Navy rapidly modified the surface-to-surface missile module launchers in their Freedom-class littoral combat ships to be able to launch longbow Hellfire missiles against drones. Now, the longbow is the variant of the long-serving Hellfire with its own onboard millimeter-wave radar seeker, making these weapons capable of fairly low-cost airborne intercepts. We also saw the US Navy Super Hornets rapidly adopt the new AIM-9X Sidewinder infrared-guided air-to-air missile to help improve their chances against these airborne threats. These are changes that were made as a result of data collected during these operations. And in a broader sense, media coverage about this cost exchange ratio tends to completely ignore the industry standard, the understood norm, that interceptors are going to cost roughly double the price of the weapons they bring down. And that's simply a matter of technological requirement. It's a lot easier to design and build a missile that can take off, fly through the air, and then find the ground again than it is to design and build a missile that can take off, fly through the air, locate a moving target traveling at supersonic or potentially even hypersonic speeds, calculate an intercept point, and bring that target down. It's sort of the difference between shooting a bullet out of a gun and shooting down that bullet with another bullet you shot yourself. One of those tasks is a lot harder than the other, and the harder the task, the more expensive it is to do reliably. And that's not just my opinion, it's also the opinion of Wes Rumbaugh, a missile defense expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who also points out that it's much more expensive to defend someone else than it is for these vessels to defend themselves or the carrier strike group that they're a part of. I'll quote him now. To defend shipping in the Red Sea, U.S. naval assets must defend larger areas rather than a specific point target. This requires interceptors with longer ranges to increase the area of protection of any individual ship. Shorter range interceptors are cheaper, but also can only provide defenses to a smaller area around the ship. These cheaper interceptors are useful for defending the ship itself from attacks, but cannot provide the area-wide coverage to also defend shipping vessels. And Rumbaugh is not wrong. If you look at the types of air defense systems or interceptors employed by the US Navy, alongside their effective ranges and their price per unit, you immediately get a sense of what he means. So let's start with the shortest range systems and work our way outward, starting with the Phalanx Sea-Whiz, which is an absolutely incredible weapon system that fires an astonishing 75 of these 20mm rounds per second. Now, each of these rounds ring in at around $45, meaning a standard 2-second burst from this weapon will send 150 of these high-explosive projectiles at your target within roughly a mile at a price of just about $7,000. If that threat is further out than a mile but less than 15, and importantly is moving slowly and consistently enough for you to try to engage with the vessel's 5-inch Mark 45 deck guns, well then, that might be a pretty good option at just about $1,600 to $2,200 per shot, depending on the high explosive load. And these weapons could be very effective against slow-moving drones or kamikaze loitering munitions, but wouldn't be as effective against cruise missiles and would likely be all but useless against ballistic missiles. If that threat's a bit further out, say between 1 and 30 miles or so away, you might turn to the aforementioned RIM 162 Evolved Sea Sparrow missile. Now, these semi-active radar-guided weapons were designed specifically to intercept supersonic and highly maneuverable anti-ship cruise missiles at fairly close range, making them very capable interceptors, and as such, they can bring down a wide variety of threats, but at a pretty steep price point of around $1.5 million per shot. But it is worth noting that because these weapons are much smaller, you can actually pack them 4 to a Mark 41 vertical launch system cell, as opposed to 1 per cell as you would need to do with larger interceptors like SM-2s, SM-3s, and the like. But if that threat is further than 30 miles out, well then you might look to the SM-2, which is a very capable interceptor capable of bringing down a whole variety of airborne threats out past 100 miles. But that added range comes with added cost at roughly $2.5 million per shot. But if 100 miles isn't enough, you can reach out as far as 150 miles with the SM-6, and all that'll cost you is $4.3 million. And if you need to stop a ballistic missile within maybe as far as 750 or so miles, well then you're going to turn to the SM-3, which, as I said at the beginning of this video, could ring in at anywhere between $12 and $28 million, depending on just how capable you need that interceptor to be. But I want to be clear that I'm not arguing that the cost-exchange ratio is a useless metric, that the US does not need to field lower-cost interceptors, or that the US wouldn't need to worry about losing a war of financial attrition against a manufacturing juggernaut like, say, China. But I do want to make sure that we understand and acknowledge just how complex the air defense enterprise is, and just how difficult this task we give the men and women in the US Navy can really be. Now, if we want to defend American interests, partners, and allies all around the globe from a wide variety of airborne threats, a job I do believe is worth doing, we also are going to have to accept that it's an expensive endeavor. So rather than comparing the cost of a single interceptor to the cost of the single drone or missile it brings down, sometimes it might be worth asking, what would be the cost of not doing that? What would be the price of not being there to America and to its allies? Because on the world stage and in terms of global conflict, there are few resources more valuable than a viable strategic alliance, and those resources are not renewable. They can't be restocked from Lockheed Martin factory lines. And while doing that may sound awfully expensive, I can assure you it's nowhere near as pricey as walking away from the strategic alliances that have brought so much stability to the world over the past 80 or so years. American alliances and global commerce are both strategically well worth defending, and while we should always be working towards bringing down the costs of each, we also, to some extent, are just going to need to accept that some things are just worth the money. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.